Along comes World War II. And our involvement in World War II leads to the federal spending growing from $10 billion a year in, let's say, 1939 to $100 billion a year in 1944, and the borrowing growing from $2 billion a year to $50 billion. And the gross domestic product going from $100 billion in 1939 to $200 billion in 1944, doubling in 4 years. Therefore, that led some people to say, you see, it wasn't the New Deal and it wasn't Keynesian economics that eliminated mass unemployment, it was the war. My response to that is, if the New Deal had been on as massive a scale as the wartime spending and borrowing, we would have fixed the problem in 1934 instead of 1944. For instance, Germany achieved full employment in the 30s with its military buildup before war even began. It was a question of scale. So therefore, what I'm saying is that I don't think you need to focus on the components of spending. I think you need to focus on the overall size. My own view is this. I believe, in general speaking, the Keynesian economics is less appropriate today and since the Great Depression, when there was mass unemployment. I think since World War II, the economy has, over the course of the business cycle, has grown well. The principal problem, of course, was the runaway inflation we suffered in the 1970s. But as I said, that to a large extent had to do with aggregate demand growing very rapidly, aided and abetted by Federal Reserve policy, which has changed. So my own belief is that, having taken all these things into account, the best thing is to try to achieve a balanced budget. Taking all these issues into account. That's my own personal view. And so I am concerned with the deficits. But I am not so much concerned with the composition of the spending with respect to generating deficits. And as a matter of fact, getting back to your question, Alan, the military spending is not a very low, is not the majority of the total spending, for sure. It's not the majority of the total spending. The total federal spending, as you can see, is approaching $3 trillion. And I'm almost positive, almost sure that the military is several hundred billion. So the military is probably closer to 10% of the total than, let's say, 50%. Now, I may be wrong. Even if it's 20%, that's still not 50%. So that was, the last time I checked. Yes, sir.
Where does the U.S. national debt number of almost $9 trillion come from?
Okay, U.S. national debt. Now, as everybody understand, there's a difference between deficit and debt. They both sound with a D, but they're not the same thing. Now, the deficit is the current borrowing, right? The current, well, I should, not even that language is sloppy. The deficit is the present difference between expenditures and revenues. And that deficit leads to borrowing. In other words, if tax revenues are $9 and government expenditures are $10, $1 has to be borrowed, right? Because of the deficit of $1. If next year expenditures are 13 and revenues, tax revenues are 11, then the deficit is $2 and $2 has to be borrowed. Now, if you add that to the previous $1 that was borrowed, then the outstanding debt becomes $3 and so on. So when the outstanding debt is 3 and the deficit is 2, if the following year we spend 18 and the revenues are 15, then we've borrowed 3 because the deficit was 3, and we add that 3 onto the previous 3, and now the outstanding debt is 6. So the $9 trillion of, let's say, outstanding debt is the consequence of all the previous years of borrowing. Does everybody get it? However, I think the outstanding private debt is probably about $50 trillion. So it's much, does everybody understand? Because the outstanding private borrowing is so much larger. So you have to put the federal into perspective. Remember, the dangerous thing about the federal is where it's going in the future. And it's projections of very, very large size, very large interest costs. And of course, if you can't pay, it's like your Visa card. If you can't pay, then the interest charges become a larger and larger share of the total expense. Steve?
Yeah, I just thought you'd want to know the military expenditures for are 470 billion.
Okay, 470, let's say that's out of, probably by now it's getting close to 3, right? So that would be, let's say 500 out of 3 would be a 6, wouldn't it? No. Yeah, am I right? Yeah, it would be a 6, so still less than 20%. So let's call it 20 even, and it's still, there we are. So thank you. Yes, sir.
So what Bernanke says about Social Security and these other things that are coming down the road where you've got to give the people not, it's an expenditure.
Yes.
And you don't have the revenues to drive it, it's inevitable that there'll be the only people who have the money will be the corporations. There'll have to be a corporate tax hike.
Well, if you want my opinion on the Social Security, the Social Security really could be dealt with fairly easily, and it's not going to be a problem immediately. It's going to be a problem down the line. Medicare is another problem down the line. But, you know, right now, the Social Security tax has a cap on it. In other words, and the cap is, I think it only applies to the first $90,000 of income. Isn't it something like that?
They raise it every year.
94,000.
Is it, how much is it now?
94,000.
94.
They raise it every year.
But suppose you greatly increase that cap or eliminated it. That alone would take care of it.
Yeah.
That would take care of the deficit right there. And it would mean that there would be a substantially higher Social Security tax on upper income earners.
Right, but that would be the same thing as you said. Then there's the supply side are saying that's a disincentive.
Exactly. No, exactly. So, but the question is really, the question is not that it can't be done. The question is whose ox is going to be gored? In other words, are we going to raise the taxes or are we going to reduce the benefits? Now, those who say our economy ought to be oriented toward you eat what you kill, they would rather, I'm putting it rather strongly, but it's almost 5 in the afternoon, right? That, of course, is, you know, they would much rather see the benefits reduced than the taxes increased. Other folks have a different point of view and say, well, we ought to increase the taxes on those who can pay and not reduce the benefits, right? And everyone in this room has their own view on where they stand on these issues, right? I don't want to substitute my judgment for yours on these matters. But the point is, just looking at the arithmetic, if we can put it that way, is the deficit will increase unless you either raise the revenue or reduce the expense, right? So once again, with a simple thing like Social Security, you could eliminate the problem instantaneously by eliminating that cap. And that would do it. You wouldn't have to reduce the benefits at all. But believe me, there will be a huge squawk at that suggestion. Because that would be a substantial increase in taxes on the upper income folks. Substantial. And so that will have to be fought out. Now it depends who's in office, doesn't it? Depending on how that is resolved. Depends who's in office. And there you are. But I'd rather put it in those terms than which is better or worse for the economy. I think there are other issues which come to the surface rather than just which is better or worse for the economy. It's who should bear the burden? What do you think is fair?